We are in the gallery of the Fondazione Antonio Renogare, where we just almost ended our installation. I'd like you to help me reconstructing all the process that brought us here. So from the invitation to today, how did you decide doing this project and how did you formalize it?
So after the invitation in May of 2016, I started looking at I had never been to Bolzano, and I started looking into the history of the city and the region, and I found it to be quite a complicated one. And when I came to visit a year ago, in July of last year, got in touch with maybe several places in the city, like the archives, the historical archives of the city, several geological places, to just try and understand a little bit, not just the recent history, but also the kind of geological history of this area. And throughout the research, I kind of maybe identified three elements that were important or interesting for me. The first one being the fact that Bolzano sits on a very particular tectonic situation, which is that the Dolomites used to be the bottom of the ocean in Africa millions of years ago, and through the shifts of tectonic plates, it ended up that not very far north from Bolzano is the closest point where Europe and Africa meet. And the idea of like a fault line running through, like a geological fault line running through the landscape was very kind of a formal device for me to look at the fact that this kind of the political and the ethnic divide that I could feel very clearly in the city was also mirrored in the geology. I discovered that there was, through this tectonic shift, an anomaly in the geology which created the Laza marble, which is in an area that's mostly made out of porphyry and dolomite stone. You have the whitest, purest marble in the world happens to be in this one quarry not very far from here. And so I visited the quarry, and I knew I was interested in using this material, but I didn't know yet what to do with it. In parallel, while looking at the kind of more recent history of the city, I discovered the story, or uncovered the story of the Acciaieria Bolzano, which is a steel factory that was developed in the 30s to kind of bring workers from Italy to populate this land after it had been taken over. And one of the kind of main products that used to be manufactured in the factory was a razor blade called Lama Bolzano, which kind of strangely has the name of the city. But in the last few years, this brand was sold, so the Lama Bolzano is no longer produced in Bolzano, it's actually produced in Germany, ironically, and but still kind of retains the name. So I found that this similarly to how the geological fault line could be a formal echo of what happened in the region. This kind of found object, the Lama, was a perfect kind of, like I couldn't have asked for a better object, that is, it's sharp, it cuts, but it also has the name written on it, the name of the city. And the third element came out of a conversation with Antonio about how he kind of started the collection, because I was very interested to understand, what is the history of the place. So in a way, first it's like the history of the region, then the history of the city, and then the history of the place. And so in a conversation with Antonio, I learned that early on he used to collect works by, local artists. And a lot of these works he doesn't have anymore, but he still had this watercolor of a landscape done in the 1940s by Hans-Josef Weber-Tirol. He's a very particular artist because he's born Austrian and he dies Italian, so the border kind of shifts on him. For me, that kind of maybe became kind of the trigger of reusing this painting and setting up with the other two elements a situation where one could reflect on this history.
So would you say that it is a show about landscape?
Yeah, I think that there's it's like an inquiry maybe, or into what a landscape means and what a landscape holds. This idea that a place, on the geological level might remain unchanged for a very long period of time, but through for particular social, political, or historical reasons, changes quite quickly. And what remains of, or what place can the geological timeline play in a more contemporary series of events? So that's maybe on the conceptual level, it is about landscape, but I think also on the very formal level, it is about the setup of a landscape, which is, so I had identified these three elements, and then you had to compose them. And I think the process of composition really follows the logic of the landscape. So you basically have the marble sand that activates the ground, then you have the razor blades that create this horizon line, and then you have the painting that opens up the window. So in a way, even in that compositional logic, I think it has a lot to do with landscape painting, with plein air, and this kind of the idea of and of course, the relationship between, the spatial relationship between this room with a window and the fact that you can look outside. So although it kind of creates a very kind of unfamiliar landscape, there's a moment where you're able to look outside and then see this more familiar terrain reflected back in.
But on the other hand, I would also say that this is a show, it's sort of a metaphysical space, right? Because you enter in this, something that looks like a moon landscape, or it's kind of it might look like a mountain landscape. It might remind people of many different things. And then you have the horizon line, which is made of these plates. So it's also, would you say it's also a show that keeps or tries to develop the tension that you find in this place?
For sure, I think that it tries to play on the balance between this kind of maybe surreal, even kind of elegant, quiet experience, and then as you get closer to the elements, maybe that's an experience you have when you're still standing outside, but as you step in and you get closer to the elements, it becomes much more perverse, right? So it becomes this, it's not that the object transforms that much, it's just because you're getting closer to it that it suddenly kind of flips upside down. And I'm very interested in this kind of the idea of something maybe elegant or minimal, turning its ugly head the closer you get to it. I don't know if it's like I'm not saying that it's like a one-to-one reflection of this place, but I think it starts kind of maybe uncovering this not so hidden history, but maybe something that for me was quite interesting.
When we talked about the show during the months of preparation, you also said that you were new in this place, and of course that was the first time. 1 year ago, you came for the first time to visit the space, and that was your first visit in Bolzano. And if you think, if we think, as in terms of landscape or in terms of culture, this location and your own town couldn't be more different in terms of how they look. But then you said, well, at the end of the day, I realized that they're more similar than you can think. Can you expand on that?
Yeah. Not that long ago, a friend of mine was saying about maybe the particularity of cities that start with the letter B. And so we're talking
I come
from a city with the letter B.
Yeah.
No, we're talking about like Brussels, Beirut, Berlin, and now Bolzano, which are cities that have a very particular history, a lot of which has to do with the divide, and how to basically think through that divide. And it was strange because I had exactly the same, the feeling I had when I came here last year was very similar to the feeling I had when I first arrived in Brussels or when I first went to Berlin. The fact that there's a particular, like a scar that has figured out a way of healing, but is an unresolved question. And for me, the attempt is not to resolve the question or to highlight the scar, but to just acknowledge the fact that it's something that is ever present. And in that sense, I was very interested in finding in Bolzano echoes of, so in that sense, Bolzano became very familiar. Even though, yes, on the surface it's kind of unfamiliar, but if you think about it landscape-wise, it's not that dissimilar, you know? Like I go to the mountains in Lebanon and we have like fields of grapevines, which are very similar to these. There's some trees that are similar. Porphyry is one of the most common stone on earth. So in a way, maybe the more recent history or certain cultural practices have made it look like we are very different. But if one goes again to the level of the geology or to the level of landscape or even to the level of agriculture, they're very kind of like similar. And this kind of recent history, which deals with a very, maybe like a radical rupture, a moment of radical rupture that one is unable to overcome, and one, I think, is unable to forget, but one has to live with. So in that sense, yeah, it was very strange that I felt very kind of familiar here, yeah.
And when we talked about over this year working together in via Skype, we talked a lot about how to develop formally the project. At the end of the day, we're talking about three found objects, because you didn't change in any way what the product was. What did you find? Whether it was the painting, whether it was the blades or the marble, but then altogether they become an environment that would be composed as a painting. I'm interested in knowing, with considering all this, I'm interested in knowing how do you find this project to be in your broader practice, whether it's a pause, whether it's a move forward, whether it's a step backwards, what this project is, because it looks different from other projects that you have done. Then if we go in depth in terms of the use of some use of materials, the importance of numbers, and the weight, and then you can find traces of your work everywhere. But in terms of how it looks like, I would say that it looks very different from other projects. So how do you find this?
I don't know. I think that it's there's difference in. I think I work in two different maybe paces, and this project belongs to the group of projects that were more. I would call it's not that they're commissions, but they're kind of one statement. More in the line of a project like the Dead Sea in 3 parts, or Colosse au pied d'argile, which are kind of one very long and hard look at a particular condition or place that results in a specific formal interpretation. And in parallel, I've kind of worked in a serial kind of sense, where I have kind of long-term projects that take on different forms, whether be it kind of different chapters over the years, or so already that is a difference in kind of temporality. So if I were to kind of look at compare this project to these other projects that were more kind of like statement pieces, I think what's always similar in everything I do is to find within the history of a place a form or a story that can help me retell its story. And that, of course, changes with the difference of place. So in the case, for example, of the Dead Sea in three parts, the kind of identifying this group of people that are topographers and working with this idea of the topography of the Dead Sea led the project more into kind of the production of this sculptural object. Whereas working here, I think throughout the process, maybe this is one of the projects that uses the most the idea of like a found object, almost without any transformation, but kind of the work relies on the composition. So it's a compositional strategy, and that relies a lot on the particularities of the architecture, right? So in a way, very quickly, the space becomes a big component of the project, and the fact that the space has these different heights, you have the window, you have these different light qualities coming in, they immediately start, even though the elements are almost homogeneous, so all the walls are cut at the same height, all the blades are, so it kind of, the project ends up being maybe like an axe, the composition becomes like an axis through which you're observing your surrounding. So in a way, that horizon line then is the reason you start realizing that the walls are different heights or that there's an interruption. So I think the project, it works backwards, in meaning that the presence of the elements, although is very present, what it's supposed to do is allow for like a blank slate on which you can reflect on something that's probably not present in here. So maybe that's, in a sense, something that I could feel is different than usual, which is the idea that the thing you're supposed to be looking at is not actually present in